Hello students, my name is Drew Donahue, pronouns she, hers, and I am a Confluence AmeriCorps member with the Johnson Creek Watershed Council. Today we are going to talk about water quality. First, I will go over what a watershed is, then I will describe the watershed matrix in the Johnson Creek watershed. After that, I will describe what water quality is, different ways to measure water quality, ways humans can negatively affect water quality specifically to Johnson Creek, and who or what poor water quality affects in this creek. I will then take you to a specific reach of Johnson Creek where I will discuss 4 specific types of water quality testing and conduct a demonstration. Lastly, we will take a look at the results, determine the health of that reach of Johnson Creek, and go over what can be done to improve water quality along Johnson Creek. So first, we are going to dive into what a watershed is. Simply put, a watershed is an area of land where water flows to one central point. On this diagram, the dotted line represents the ridge, which is a boundary of the watershed. All of the water within this boundary flows down into one central body of water, which in this case is a river which flows to a lake or ocean. Anywhere you are standing on land, you are standing in a watershed. The water has to flow somewhere, and eventually all water flows to the ocean. The Johnson Creek watershed starts in Boring, Oregon and flows to Milwaukee, Oregon. There are about 122 miles of creek, and the watershed covers approximately 54 square miles. Over 180,000 people live in Johnson Creek watershed with numerous different land uses, such as cities, suburbs, and farmland. But this watershed isn't just contained to this one spot. Johnson Creek is what we call a tributary. It flows into another bigger body of water known as the Willamette River. This also means that the Johnson Creek watershed is part of the bigger Willamette watershed. The Willamette also flows into another body of water called the Columbia River. Again, this means that the Willamette watershed is part of the bigger Columbia watershed, which also means Johnson Creek watershed is part of the Columbia watershed. And then the Columbia flows to the Pacific Ocean. So why does this matter that Johnson Creek is part of a bigger matrix? This matters because anything that happens to Johnson Creek also affects the Willamette, which then affects the Columbia, which then affects the Pacific Ocean. Everything is connected, so when we think about water quality along Johnson Creek, remember that water quality will also affect numerous other bodies of water and those living along them. Before we dive into the specifics of water quality, I would also like to talk about the watershed's original stewards, also known as the First Peoples. This watershed was home to the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes. Portland, Oregon currently has the 9th largest urban Native American population in the U.S., with over 380 federally recognized tribes represented in the urban Portland metropolitan area. Native Oregonians continue to be active land stewards and community members. Wisdom of the Elders is a great nonprofit that works with us and does great restoration work along Johnson Creek. Before we get into the specifics about water quality, let's start with the question of what is water quality? Water quality describes the condition of the water, including chemical, physical, and biological characteristics. These are things we can measure with certain tools and are often related to the wildlife and humans it affects. Water quality determines the health of that body of water and its livability. So how can we measure water quality? Oftentimes this requires certain equipment such as certain chemical liquids, electronic devices, test tubes, and even nets. We can measure all kinds of things such as pH, temperature, dissolved oxygen content, turbidity, bacteria, nutrients, ammonia, metals, mercury, and even the presence or absence of different organisms that live in the water can tell us about its water quality levels. Now that we have gone over what can be measured, let's dive into what negatively affects the levels of these tests in the Johnson Creek watershed. Since Johnson Creek covers a wide area, there are lots of factors that can hurt the creek. Cars play a big role, and often their oils can run off into the creek. Johnson Creek watershed is also very urbanized. There is a constant construction which is happening along the creek and can cause erosion. Stormwater that collects along the streets eventually flows into Johnson Creek and carries all the pollutants and other nasty things into it as well. Urbanization can also reduce the amount of plants along the creek. Plants provide a multitude of benefits that we will talk about later in the presentation. Agriculture also poses a problem. Fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and any other chemicals used in this industry can wash into the creek when it rains heavily. Pets are also another large source of pollution. Dog waste, if not picked up, can wash into the creek and cause serious pollution. But why should we care about water quality? Why does it matter if pH levels are too low or temperature levels are too high and so on? Because lots of creatures living along these bodies of water. Here are some amazing wildlife that lives along Johnson Creek. There are otters, frogs, salamanders, ducks, dragonflies, bumblebees, newts, amphibian egg masses, which is pictured in the middle right there, salmon, lamprey, which is a prehistoric fish on the bottom right, blue herons, beavers, raccoons, owls, deer, and so much more. Johnson Creek is very diverse. We are one of the only creeks in Portland that have endangered and threatened salmon still living in it. Here is a really cute video of beavers at Arrow Heights Park along Johnson Creek just to show how much activity is going on in this creek. Next, we are going to talk about and demonstrate 4 target water quality tests that we perform along Johnson Creek.
Students, we're currently at Johnson Creek Park and we're going to dive right into the 4 tests that I mentioned earlier: temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, and turbidity. So the first test that we're going to do is temperature. So we're going to use this probe here to measure the temperature of this part of Johnson Creek. So water temperature is one of the most important factors for survival of aquatic life. If temperatures are too high or too low, productivity can decrease and metabolic function ceases. Organisms vary greatly in their temperature tolerance. Some have very narrow ranges, others have very wide ranges. And any organism can die if the temperature goes outside of their range. So this is a fairly easy test. We're going to take this probe and we're going to dip it into the creek. So you want to cover the bottom, kind of like where the holes are. And we're going to hold it there for a minute. I took the temperatures earlier, so we don't have to hold it there for a minute, but that's how you would do the test. So the temperatures I got earlier were 14 degrees Celsius and 57 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're going to go over the results a little later in the video. So we're going to jump right into the next test. Our next test is going to be pH. So I'll show you these slides here of the different colors and their numbers. So pH value shows the intensity of acid or alkaline conditions. In general, acidity is a measure of a substance's abilities to neutralize bases, and alkalinity is a measure of a substance's abilities to neutralize acids. So to kind of grasp the pH numbers, generally, battery acid is considered a measure of 1, which is extremely acidic. A lemon would be 2, which is also very acidic. Coffee is about a 5, which is mildly acidic. Distilled water is about a 7, and that's considered neutral. An antacid is 9.5, which is basic, and bleach is 12.5, which is strongly basic. So anything below 6.5 and above 8.5 is generally not hospitable for aquatic organisms. pH usually doesn't vary that much. So now we're going to dive into the test here. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to fill this tube here with 10 millimeters of water. So I'll dump it into the creek here. So after we're done with that, we're going to take our wide range indicator drops and we're going to add 10 of those. Alright, and then after that, we're going to put the cap back on. And then we're going to gently tilt it back and forth to mix the mixture together. So then after we're done with that, we're going to take our viewer here and we're going to put the tube into the viewer. And then those slides you saw earlier, we're going to use to compare the colors. So I'm going to start with the 3.0 to 6.5 range. We're going to enter that into our viewer. So right now we're just comparing the colors. We're trying to see what color best matches our test tube here on the slide. So which one matches the best. So you can take a look at that and see what you think. And now I'm going to switch out the slides and get the other range of pH. So now we're going to do 7.0 to 10.5. So now take a look at that and see what color you think best matches. Alright, so the color that I had determined was it's probably closest to around 7.5. It's a little greener than the yellow of the 7, but it's pretty close. It's in the 7.5 range. So next, we're going to dive into dissolved oxygen content. So these are kind of the colors you're going to see here. Dissolved oxygen content is the level of free non-compound oxygen present in water or other liquids. Fish and other aquatic life need oxygen to breathe, just like we do. The difference is that they extract it in a form of dissolved oxygen from the creek, and they use their gills rather than lungs. So for this test, what we're going to do is we're going to fill this tube here with 25 millimeters of water from the creek. It's about right there. And then we're going to take this, which is called an ampule, and we're going to put it in our test tube. At the bottom of the test tube, there's little rivets there. This is where you can break off the tip, so I'm going to do that real quick. All right, and then when you break off the tip, make sure you don't take it out of the water. You want to leave it in there for a couple seconds, and you want to make sure you don't break off too much of it, otherwise the liquid will seep out into our test tube here. So then we wait a couple seconds, and it's turning blue there. So now I'll take it out of the water, and now what we're going to do is similar to pH. We're going to rock it back and forth. We're going to wait for this little air bubble to go up, and then we'll do it again, wait for it to go back up, and again, and wait for it to go back up. Generally, we would wait 2 minutes in order for the colors to settle, but I had actually already done one earlier. So here it is. It's been waiting for about 2 minutes. And now we're going to do something similar to the pH, and we're going to take our display slide here. So we're going to try to match our test ampule best to the display ampule. So which color does it best match? So we'll kind of move it around there to see what you think. Great, so the color that I thought it best matches was 11. So our dissolved oxygen content is about 11. So the next test we're going to do is turbidity. And we're going to use this slide here with these things called Secchi discs, these little circles with the black triangles in them. So turbidity is the measure of sediment in the water. Sediment levels can affect wildlife by clogging their gills and making it hard to breathe. Sediments can also build up over time and block water passage. And if there's a lot of sediment, they can even absorb sunlight and make the body of water hotter. So for this test, it's a fairly simple test. What we're going to do is we're going to take this tube and fill it to the 25 millimeter mark here. So yeah, I'm going to fill that with the creek water here. All right, so it's about at the 25 millimeter mark. And then what we're going to do is take that card you saw earlier, and see how it has an outline there? We're going to place our tube to match the outline. So you want the whole tube to be over that middle Secchi disc. So now we're going to look into the tube. So what you do for this test is similar to the other tests. You're going to compare this Secchi disc to the ones around it. So how faded is your middle one compared to these ones? Is it super faded and it's 100 JTU, or is it not faded at all, so it has zero sediment in it? I looked at this earlier and I determined it's about like 5 JTU. It barely has any sediment in it. It's pretty clear. I can see it almost all the way down. Yeah, so that is the last for our test today. We're going to go over the results a little later in the video. One other thing to make sure is that you dispose of all your chemicals in a safe container. So next we're going to move into the results.
So we were just at Johnson Creek Park, located at Southeast 21st Avenue and Clatsop Street. This park is about 4 acres and contains the confluence of Johnson Creek and one of its tributaries, Crystal Springs Creek. It is about a mile above the confluence of Johnson Creek and the Willamette River as well. Now that we have done the tests, we're going to discuss the results. But first I want to talk about the type of tests we did. These tests are known to be subjective. That means that each test is based on or influenced by personal feelings, tastes, or opinions of each individual. Although these tests are not extremely accurate compared to a machine that tests water, they generally give the right range, and this isn't enough to determine the health of a stream fairly accurately. So the first test we did was temperature. The results we got were 14 degrees Celsius, which is about 57 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a fairly cold temperature for such a sunny day. The outside temperature was about 23 degrees Celsius or 73 degrees Fahrenheit. Now we're going to take a look at a graph provided by a great organization called World Salmon Watch. There is a temperature gauge there in the middle. I put a black line through the temperature that we measured. So the way this graph works is everything that crosses the black line means that they can live in those kinds of conditions. So this line crosses juvenile salmon growth, egg and alevin incubation, salmon spawning, and salmon migration. At the bottom of it, it crosses aquatic insects, pond snails, and catfish. This means that the temperature we measured, which was 57 degrees Fahrenheit, is a livable temperature for all of those organisms. So overall, temperature on Johnson Creek at Johnson Creek Park is pretty good, a fairly healthy temperature. So the next test we did is pH. The results we got were 7.5, which was the yellowish color range. Similar to before, this graph shows the range in the middle. I put a line through 7.5. This line seems to cross all of the bars below. Salmonoids, mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies, which are all macroinvertebrates like I mentioned earlier, pond snails, and all the rest. This means that 7.5 pH is livable for all of those creatures. Remember, pH does not vary that much in a creek. Distilled water is around 7. Anything above 8.5 or below 6.5 is lethal to most aquatic organisms. Next is dissolved oxygen content. The results we got were 11, which we measure in units of parts per million, so 11 parts per million, which was towards the more darker blue range. On this graph, I put the line over the 11, which crosses over salmon growth, carp, mayfly, stonefly, mosquito, pond snail, and crayfish. It looks like egg and alevin incubation and salmon spawning doesn't quite reach the mark. This means there is not enough oxygen for these stages of the salmon cycle. This means that 11 dissolved oxygen content is mostly livable. It's a pretty good score, but could be improved. Lastly, we have turbidity. The results we got was 5 JTU. I don't have a graph for this one, but in general, anything above 10 JTU is not a great living condition for organisms. It won't kill them necessarily if it exceeds 10, but if high turbidity is persistent in the creek, then it can be lethal. So 5 JTU is pretty great. The creek was clear and didn't have that much suspended sediments. So overall, what is the health of Johnson Creek at Johnson Creek Park? I would say pretty good. All the readings were in fairly good ranges and definitely could host salmon. But of course, not all areas along Johnson Creek have this grade of water quality. So what can we do to improve it in these spots? There are a lot of ways to improve water quality that are important, but the great solution is plants. By planting along Johnson Creek, they can provide shade, which lowers the temperature of the creek. Trees also hold soil in their roots, which can reduce erosion and reduce the turbidity levels. Trees also produce oxygen, provide habitat for all kinds of wildlife, including salmon, and remove chemicals from the water. This is a very simple and effective solution to improve water quality along the creek, and something we can continue to do at the Council. Thank you so much for watching Johnson Creek Watershed Council's water quality video. If you have any videos you would like to see in the future, please email the email provided in the comments. We also provide field trips, which includes water quality testing. See details below. Thank you again.